The summer night was cool. Even as the blue flame overtook some parts of the forest, smoke rose into the sky, obscuring the moon and the stars. The training camp's location was meant to be a kept secret, but the League of Villains somehow found its whereabouts. The Vanguard Action Squad had scattered around the force, besieging the UA students as they executed their main mission: capture Katsuki Bakugo, and, if they're able, anyone else that they can coax into joining them. Mr. Compress was quite successful with that undertaking. After watching the monstrous Dark Shadow destroy Moonfish, he followed the group of students. The magician smiled behind his mask. That Raven Boy would be useful for our cause, and Bakugo was with them too. It would be quite a simple task for me to pick them off from the group. The stage is set. Time to start the show. Mr. Compress slipped away into the forest shadows. Ready to perform, Uraraka, Asui, Todoroki, Soji, and the injured Midoriya didn't even notice Bakugo and Tokoyami's absence until it was too late. Being the showman that he was, Mr. Compress revealed himself and proclaimed that it was he who took their friends. The magician avoided Todoroki's ice attack with ease before making his swift getaway to the rendezvous point. It quickly became apparent that the UA students weren't going to be able to catch up to the criminals while on the ground. Although greatly injured from his fight with Muscular, Midoriya came up with a plan that would utilize Uraraka's and Asui's quirks, as well as the webbing between Soji's dupli arms. After Uraraka sacrificed her jacket to make a makeshift split for Midoriya's arms, she made her 3 male classmates weightless while Asui grasped them with her amphibian tongue. They weren't just going to stand by when they had the opportunity to save their friends. Mr. Compress arrived at the rendezvous. Seeing his cohorts waiting for him, Dabi's icy glare was aimed at the magician. You're late. Did you at least get what we came here for? Of course I did. A mere apprentice could have pulled it off. A speeding force crashes into Mr. Compress's back, forcing the magician to crash into the ground. Midoriya had landed on the villain while Soji and Todoroki pinned down the arms. Give our friends back, you jerk! The vanguards were taken off guard, not expecting Mr. Compress to be followed. The only one that was annoyed by this turn of events was Toga, a soft blush of a smile on her face upon seeing Midoriya again. Dabi threw flames at the students. Shoji and Todoroki dodged to the side while Midoriya ducked under the fire, the flame licking at his face and chest. An antagonizing stare-down was held between the two sides as Mr. Compress picked himself up and rejoined his teammates. Midoriya, Todoroki. Soji held up the 2 marbles he had in his hand. We got what we came here for. Let's get out of here. The expressions of victory was quickly swept away from the students' faces as Mr. Compress chuckled. The magician snapped his fingers. The marbles in Shoji's grasp returned to their original form, chunks of ice. Todoroki couldn't hide his shock expression. That's my ice. When did he have the time to? A simple sleight of hand, my boy. After you attacked me with your quirk, I helped myself to a few pieces and hid your friends in the last place you'd look. Partly lifting up his mask, Mr. Compress opened his mouth to reveal 2 more marbles on his tongue. Mr. Compress wasn't prepared for Midoriya's retaliation. The green-haired boy used 10% of full calling to headbutt Mr. Compress in the stomach. The marbles flew from the magician's mouth. Soji and Todoroki bolted to grab them. Soji was successful in claiming one of the marbles. Todoroki wasn't so fortunate. Dabi snatched the marbles from Todoroki's reach. A cunning smile was on the scarred man's face. Poor Shoto Todoroki. It seems you were a little too slow. Something about his voice seemed familiar to Todoroki, but could it really be? No, it couldn't be. Todoroki must have just been imagining it. A few dark purple warp gates appeared near each of the villains. Twice leapt through his gateway. Toga stepped into her gateway, waving goodbye to Midoriya. Dabi and Mr. Compress waited outside of their gates, glaring at the UA students. Hey, Compress. Check to make sure. Of course. Mr. Compress reached into the inner coat pocket and pulled out a 3rd marble. I prepared one marble earlier before our little invasion took place. Let's see who claimed what they desired. Mr. Compress snapped his fingers to reveal what the marbles contained. The marble in the magician's hand turned into Bakugo. A pit formed in Midoriya's stomach when the villain put his friend in a headlock and drew a knife on the blonde. The content of Shoji's marble erupted and clattered to the ground. Frustration and distress coursed through the dopely armed teen to see the pile of sticks and rocks that came out of the marble. A raven-haired teen appeared from the marble in Dabi's possession. The scarred young man's hand clasped around Tokoyami's neck, while a cobalt flame danced in the other hand. Both captured students were in too much of a daze to fully recognize the danger that they were in, even as the students pulled them through the warp gate. Kachan! Tokoyami! With no plan in mind, Midoriya ran for his childhood friend. Shoji did the same, running as fast as he could at Tokoyami while extending and splitting his dupli arms as far as he could go. Stay back, Deku! Bakugo disappeared through the warp gate with Mr. Compress, the midnight purple passageway closing soon after. Tokoyami reached out towards Shoji in an attempt to bridge the minuscule gap. Shoji felt his friend's fingertips brushing on his own, causing his heart to jump into his throat. Ardent pain consumed several of Shoji's arms, reducing some to charred flesh and ash. He was forced to back away from Tokoyami and Dabi's attack. Shoji! Dabi pulled Tokoyami the rest of the way through the warp gate. Todoroki was frozen where he stood. Witnessing his classmates fall to their knees in defeat, Midoriya threw his head back and screamed in pure agony and despair. Shoji nursed his heavily burnt arm, frustrated and tearing spilling from his eyes and soaking into his mask. Todoroki heard something coming through the forest toward the clearing. He turned and was about to attack before seeing that it was just Uraraka and Asui, out of breath with worried expressions. Where's Bakugo and Tokoyami? We couldn't save them. The villains got away with them. The summer air became warm. Even as the forest fire died down, soot and ash rose into the air while Midoriya's sorrowful wails echoed into the sky. Dabi and Mr. Compress entered the bar, their bounty in hand. They threw their prisoners to the hardwood floor. Bakugo quickly picked himself up and tried to retaliate against the abductors. The hilt of Spinner's weapon collided in the back of the blonde's head, knocking the teenager out quickly. Tokoyami had just set himself up to meet the business end of the hero killer's disciple's blade. I suggest not doing anything like your friend tried to do. A man with a messy teal hair approached the UA students. Tokoyami, recognizing the hand on the young villain's face, and knew it was Shigaraki. He remembered the handman from the USJ. Tokoyami glanced at the comatose Bakugo. It would be difficult for the jet black hero to engage with 7 adversaries and defend his classmate at the same time. Things could get unpleasant if you were to try something. Tokoyami slowly stood up with his hands visible. His crimson eyes darted between each of the villains in the room. The Raven teen recognized the dark, wispy man behind the bar from the USJ. Everyone else was unknown to him. He would have to watch and listen to gather information. That's a good little hero. Tokoyami could hear the nasty smile in Shigaraki's voice. Dabi, Toga, Compress. Set up Bakugo in his seat. Spinner and Magni. Set up our other guest in his own chair. Tokoyami let the 2 villains restrain his torso to the back of the chair with thick ropes. His arms were bound behind his back, and his legs were secured to the legs of the chair. Bakugo was in a worse situation considering the materials that were being used on him. Not only were heavy chains binding his chest and legs to the chair, but his arms were locked in bulky handcuffs that covered his arms up to the elbows. Tokoyami sat quietly in his chair, trying to listen to the League's whispering conversations and read each member's behavior. He eternally debated on trying to loosen his ropes to be ready for an escape opening, but the ice-blue eyes of Dabi were keeping a lethal vigilance on the UA student. Tokoyami felt his heart increase its tempo as he tried to mask his fear. Bakugo's pained groan gained Tokoyami's attention. The blonde first noticed the bulky cuffs on his arms before glaring at Dabi. The scarred man just smiled, amused at the explosive boy's frustration. Spinner called Dabi over to the group, needing his input or another on something in the hushed conversation. Dabi shot one last look at the two boys, saying with his eyes not to try anything. Bakugo leaned slightly closer to Tokoyami, while the villain's back was turned to them. "Now's our chance. We should bust out and get a jump on them." Tokoyami was amazed that Bakugo was capable of speaking so quietly. "We best not. We are outnumbered, and it's very likely that we are also outclassed. Plus, we don't know where we are." Dabi turns his head to the UA students, his eyes shockingly cold. Tokoyami stopped talking instantly. The two red-eye students didn't break eye contact with Dabi until the villain returned his attention to his team. Tokoyami continued speaking even softer than before. "Besides, that one's not likely going to take his full attention off us anytime soon. If you think I'm going to do nothing and wait to be rescued, if an opportunity presents itself, of course we'll take it. For now, we observe and gain intel." Bakugo growled and cursed under his breath. He hated that plan, but the bird was right. There wasn't much that they could do in their situation. Watching and waiting was one of the few options. The League of Villains dispersed from their conversation, moving to different parts of the room and getting comfortable. All eyes were on the high schoolers. Neither one would admit it or let it show, but Bakugo and Tokoyami were a little intimidated.
"Apologies for the wait. We were only expecting to have Bakugo as our guest tonight, and I needed to know how we managed to get you caught up in this, Tokoyami."
Shigaraki was acting too cordial for either boy's liking.
"But I suppose that we could extend our offer to both of you."
"And why the hell would we even listen to any offer you have?" The young villain turned his attention to Bakugo, seemingly unfazed by the offense.
"You want to be greater than All Might, right, Bakugo? To prove that you are stronger than the #1 hero. Wouldn't the simple way to do that would be to eliminate him? You've got a quirk and the potential to do it. All you need is the right person to back you up."
"So, you want me to join your league?"
"That's exactly what I'm saying. Are you interested?"
"Fat chance! There's no way in hell I'd betray everything I've been working towards, only to throw it all away to join you losers." Shigaraki scratched his neck a few times. Tokoyami had noticed that the teal-haired man would do that when he became frustrated or annoyed. Shigaraki stood from his chair and looked at the Raven team.
"What about you, Tokoyami? As someone with features like yours, and being one that walks with the shadows, it's probably common that people look at you with disgust and fear."
"Although people think my appearance is strange, I'm no monster. I'm not like you, or your conclave of villainy." Shigaraki inhaled sharply and began to scratch his neck again. His nails were digging deeper into his skin, and blood began to leak to the surface. He takes a couple steps toward Tokoyami, the floorboards quietly creaking with each footfall. The Raven teen started to squirm against the ropes. He tried to keep his emotions steady, to keep Dark Shadow in check, but it's challenging to remain calm when staring down an apathetic maniac.
"I heard what you did to our friend, Moonfish. You weren't holding anything back, and you nearly killed him. And all it took to trigger such a brutality was your friend getting a simple flesh wound."
Shigaraki leaned close to the restrained student. Tokoyami was able to look past the hand on the villain's face and see his eyes clearly. Red eyes, just like his own.
"Imagine if a little incident happened in a crowded place, like a mall, or a residential area. Many people would get hurt. Some probably would die. And you would be labeled as a villain just because you couldn't control your emotions or your quirk."
Tokoyami's eyes shifted to the floor as Shigaraki's words rang in his head. All Bakugo could do was watch the event unfold.
The people you swore to protect would never trust you again, and everyone that you thought you were friends with would hate you and fear you.
Tokoyami's body was so tensed up that he was trembling. The memory of the pain of Dark Shadow's destruction replayed behind his eyes. The way that sentient shadow thrashed about, attacking anything that moved or made noise, was horrific. He was lucky that none of his classmates got hurt, and that Midoriya had a plan to stop the madness. Bakugo may not be the most social person, but he could read people fairly easily. Tokoyami was fearful of his quirk and ashamed of his lack of control. "Hey, Bird Brain! Are you actually listening to what this bastard is saying? Your quirk may be stubborn, but it's also multifaceted. You'll gain more control with training, but if you lose control again, I'll kick your ass like last time." Tokoyami didn't move or change his shadowy expression. Shigaraki tilted his head to the side, an idea forming inside his mind. He raised his hand, casually beginning to move his hand closer to the Raven teen's face. Tokoyami flinched back, turning away while Bakugo tugged at his chains angrily. "Get away from him, Krusty!"
You're a smart kid. There's one little thing that you could do to easily stop me.
Bakugo pulled at the chains again, small explosions illuminating through the seams of the cuffs. Some of the other villains laughed and smiled at the turnabout. Bakugo knew he could handle fighting villains, but dealing with a hostage situation was something he knew he was lacking in. Tokoyami took in a breath through clenched teeth, the air through the gaps sounding like a leaking hose. Despite the situation, the young man found himself to smile. He understood darkness and fear, how useful it was to use in combat. Now that he had the moment to clear his mind, he knew what he had to do. Besides, Tokoyami wasn't the only one Shigaraki was threatening. "You should reconsider what you're doing. Broken bones take months to heal."
You're in no position for remarks like that, Tokoyami.
Shigaraki grabbed hold of Tokoyami's beak, intentionally keeping his pinky up.
Not while your life is in the palm of my hand.
"It's not just my life you're playing with." Before Shigaraki could come up with a retort, something burst from Tokoyami and crashed into the young villain. He crashed into Magni and Twice, who were only just able to catch him. They pulled their leader to his feet as everyone tried to figure out what hit Shigaraki.
He's got a point, you know. You don't want to end up like your buddy, Moonfish, do you?
A dark figure with a bird head was coming out of Tokoyami's body. Dark Shadow was rather large, his wingspan covering half of the width of the room, as he stood protectively in front of Bakugo and Tokoyami.
So, who wants to flirt with the darkness? Come on, don't be shy. I just plan on snapping you in half like a Kit Kat.
No one moved for a long time. No one could have predicted the sudden turn of events. A ceiling light danced around the room. Dabi stepped closer to Dark Shadow without fear due to the flame he held in his hand. Dark Shadow shrank down but remained vigilant and unmoving from the front of the UA students. "You're not as tough as you look, Shadow." Dabi moved his flame closer to Shadow, causing the entity to shrink further. "You actually seem quite harmless." Dark Shadow started to attack but halted when Dabi's flame became brighter and aimed at Bakugo. Both students were visibly frustrated at the constant flux in control of the situation. A subtle grin turned up on Dabi's face.
So, boys, will we resume a pleasant conversation, or do things have to get a little toasty?
Blue lights and shadows danced across the walls. The crackling flames were the only sound that the League could hear. But the restrained students can hear another sound. They could hear their pulses thumping in their ears. Bakugo and Tokoyami were very much between a rock and a hard place. If Dark Shadow attacked Dabi, Dabi would turn Bakugo into a cinder. But Tokoyami or Bakugo would definitely get hurt if Dark Shadow stood down completely. Then again, their pleasant conversation could turn for the worse very quickly. Magni and Twice picked up Shigaraki as he straightened the hand on his face. He stood next to Dabi to re-establish his grasp on the situation.
You two are lucky that my master is interested in recruiting one of you two. Otherwise... I would have no remorses in dusting the both of you here and now.
So there's someone higher in the chain of command? I should have guessed, considering how inexperienced and how little control you seem to have.
Shigaraki took personal offense to that comment. He shoved past Dark Shadow and grabbed Tokoyami around the neck, tackling the tied-up student with enough force to knock him onto the floor. The villain had enough self-control to not wrap all of his fingers around the student, but he was running short on patience quickly. Dark Shadow was about to attack Shigaraki in kind, but stopped when Dabi cleared his throat. The scarred man had blue flames aimed at Bakugo, who looked resentful about how things were going.
You think I'm not in control?
Shigaraki tightened his grip around the Raven team. Tokoyami gasped for air, his lungs starting to burn.
I'm not the one tied down to a chair. I'm not the one who could be killed by a single touch.
Bakugo watched as the villain slammed his classmate's head repeatedly into the hardwood floor. Painful cracking noises resounded with each hit. A splotch of red formed at the point of impact as the damage to the wood became more visible.
You're at my mercy. I'm in complete control.
That's enough, Tamura.
The shadowy bartender's voice resounded clearly throughout the room. Kuogori's essence moved towards his young ward. He landed next to his ear and spoke softly.
You must clear yourself. Even if they won't join us, they will still be useful for the Master. Besides, I believe I know how to convince them.
After glaring at Tokoyami one more time, Shigaraki got off the young man. He begrudgingly sat the chair back upright before taking a seat at the bar. Tokoyami tried to shake the pain from his head, but it lingered. Dark Shadow looked at his wielder worriedly as the Raven teen squinted his eyes. The room's lights seemed to have become brighter to him.
Quit messing around. There's nothing you can do to make us join you. So go right ahead and do your worst. He's right.
It took a moment for Tokoyami to reorient himself and find his voice.
You won't be able to break us easily.
Kuogiri looked between the two boys. From what he had witnessed of behavior of the young heroes in training, he knew what could be done to persuade them. Kuogiri turned to Toga and gestured for her to move forward. The high school girl smiled and skipped toward the bar.
Are you gonna let me play with them, Kuogiri?
If you would be so kind, take care of Bakugo. Show him your playful side.
Yay!
Toga brought out a syringe that was attached to a glass flask. She approached Bakugo eagerly, the smile never leaving her face. Dabi took a few steps back out of Toga's way, moving closer to Tokoyami.
I'd hate to be in your shoes, Bakugo. Little Miss Crazy doesn't really hold back when it comes to her playtime.
Bakugo glared at the blonde girl, speechless for once while trying to size her up.
You're not as cute as Izuku, but I know how to make you cuter.
What the hell are you?
The needle plunged into Bakugo's thigh. He cried out while Toga giggled like a child. Tokoyami was completely horrified by the young woman's lack of empathy.
Suck, 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 suck.
Toga repeated the mantra as the flask filled with blood. The needle was removed from Bakugo's leg with little effort and practiced grace once the container was full.
500 milliliters should be enough for now.
The explosive boy did his best to try to keep a strong and angry facade, but he started feeling dizzy. A visible chill traveled up Bakugo's spine as Toga twisted grin reached from ear to ear.
Oh, I'm not done playing with you yet, Bakugo. I haven't shown you my favorite thing yet.
Toga pulled out a knife. Tokoyami didn't like where this was going. He tried to have Dark Shadow disarm the girl, but Dabi obstructed the attack. The scarred man grabbed Dark Shadow by the back of the neck. Cobalt flames encased the shade. Bakugo's pain noises mixed with Dark Shadow's cries of agony. Tokoyami's quirk retreated closer to him and became much smaller. Dabi forced Tokoyami to watch Bakugo being tortured. Toga decorated the young man with several lacerations that became more aggressive with each action. Toga quickly got bored with giving Bakugo little cuts. She drew back her knife, intending to stab Bakugo in his side.
Stop! You'll kill him!
Surprisingly, Kuogiri stopped Toga. He made the warp gate in the way of the attack, but put the exit near Tokoyami's face. The Raven teen flinched when the blade glazed his cheek.
There's an easier way to make her stop, Tokoyami.
After regaining his composure, Shigaraki stood from the bar stool and walked to the center of the room. These students were going to help him and the League whether they wanted to or not.
Just know that the longer you wait to answer...
Toga dragged her knife across Bakugo's arm, gaining an agonizing shriek from the blonde.
He'll bleed like a slaughtered pig, and it will be all your fault.
Tokoyami's eyes shifted to the side. Bakugo met the side glance and shook his head. He refused to be responsible for one of his classmates for changing sides, no matter his current condition.
Don't even consider it, bird brain. She isn't as tough as she...
Toga plunged the knife into Bakugo's leg. She only nicked the femoral artery, but that didn't stop the blood from gushing from the wound. Explosions popped within the bulky cuffs reflexively. Bakugo pulled against his chains, wanting to get away from the blood-lusting girl, but he couldn't break free. Dark Shadow grabbed Toga's arm before she could stab Bakugo again. No further actions were taken to harm the girl, but the Shade's eyes did flash red.
Enough.
Desperation and angst dripped from Tokoyami's voice before turning his crimson gaze onto Shigaraki.
As long as you swear upon your life and soul that you will not harm my classmate any further.
He had to force the knot in his throat down before continuing his statement.
I'll join.
Someone raps on the bar door, debasing the tension in the room.
Hello, pizza delivery.
Everyone fell quiet. No one wanted to claim the pizza that was waiting on the other side of the door.
Detroit, smash!
Instead, there were several deep dish fists of justice from the symbol of peace. All Might smashed through the wall of the hideout, scattering bricks and wood across the space. Dark Shadow did his best to shield Tokoyami and Bakugo from the scattering debris. It only took a few short seconds for the heroes to apprehend the villains, making sure to knock out Kuwagiri and Dabi. All Might moved his students once all the villains were wrapped up, breaking them free from their restraints.
Bakugo, Tokoyami, are you two all right?
Neither of the teens answered right away. Tokoyami was more concerned about getting Bakugo to his feet and supporting him. A majority of the blonde's wounds were surface abrasions, blood merely dripping from them, but the stab to his leg and arm weren't so kind. Crimson fluid formed rivers that traveled down his limb and stained the hard wood. He was much paler than he was a few hours ago.
Bakugo needs medical attention.
Tokoyami was melancholy as he made his classmate the priority of the situation. Now having his arms free from the cuffs, Bakugo used small explosions to cauterize the wound on his leg. After gritting his teeth through the pain, Bakugo's biting glare was aimed at Tokoyami and All Might.
I'm fine. I can stand my own.
Bakugo removed Tokoyami from him, trying to hide his fatigue.
These assholes tried to make us join their league. When that didn't work, the blonde girl started to torture me as a kind of blackmail to persuade Tokoyami. He was about to cave in when you showed up.
Tokoyami clenched his teeth to avoid All Might's eyes. The number one hero ignored the grim state of the Raven teen and embraced his students.
Don't worry. I'll do everything in my power so they won't hurt either of you again.
Silence echoed around the room for a while. It was surprisingly calm, even with Shigaraki's temper tantrum.
I hate you. I hate you. I hate you.
Several gray fluid masses appeared, acting as a passageway for the dozen or so Nomu creatures who marched through. The heroes quickly became overwhelmed and confused, thinking that they have already prevented Kuwagiri from summoning any backup. But this wasn't the wispy butler's doing. Someone else orchestrated this attack. Tokoyami and Bakugo began to cough and retch at the same gray substance that was starting to consume the villains. All Might tried to grab hold of his students, but they slipped through his fingers. The two students and the villains fell out of the cold, damp void and landed on the concrete. Those who were conscious stood from where they were dropped and took in their surroundings. Devastated buildings were collapsed in heaps, resembling the epicenter of an explosion or massive fight.
Forgive me for the rough exit.
A commanding, bassy voice echoed throughout the seemingly empty landscape.
The new warp quirk I acquired needs some more fine-tuning.
Footsteps crunched against the rubble. The man that strolled out of the shadows was dressed in a tailored suit and wore a strange helmet-like device on his head. He looked to be in his late 40s, mid-50s at most, but he had a gait of something much older. Bakugo glared at All For One, seeing him as an enemy, possibly the master that Shigaraki had mentioned earlier. He got into a defense stance while shuffling a few steps back. Bakugo felt his legs start to quiver, unsure if it was from blood loss or fear. When Tokoyami got a look at the godfather-like figure, a chill shot through his spine and his stomach contorted into knots. Something about this man disturbed the Raven teen to his core. The presence of All For One felt empty, cold, and dark. Something older than any person that the students knew. Although the man had no visible eyes, Tokoyami felt as though what was looking through him was time-worn and heinous. Bakugo, we should get away from this place now. I know, but I... Bakugo couldn't finish the sentence. His mind felt foggy and his legs wouldn't move. Tokoyami could tell that neither of them would last long in a fight against the League and All for One, even if they weren't injured. The Raven team grabbed Bakugo's arm and tried to run, but noticed the others that were with him. Those of the League that were battle-ready moved closer to the students. Tokoyami scanned over the 6 villains while Bakugo remained petrified, eyes locked on the face of the symbol of evil.
Tamura, recapture these 2. I will secure your escape route.
Black and red tendrils emerged from All for One's fingers and stabbed into Cool Gary's body. He forced the unconscious man's quirk to activate, opening a familiar purple and black warp gate. Seeing this caused fear to spike within the UA students and a couple of the villains. One for All crossed his hands behind his back and floated several feet into the air. The first of the League to move into action was Spinner and his blade. The hero killer's disciple aimed his attack at the more human-looking student. Without uttering a word, Tokoyami pulled Bakugo out of danger and forced his classmate to stand behind him. Neither of them were in any condition to fight, but they weren't being given much of a choice.
Focus, Bakugo, or we will die for sure.
After hearing his classmate's voice, Bakugo cleared his mind and got into a fighting stance.
I know! I'm working on it.
Magni and Spinner, followed by Shigaraki, rushed straight at Tokoyami. Dark Shadow burst forth to meet the villains, appearing much larger and more dangerous than earlier. The Scaly Man and Trans Woman avoided the Shade's swiping claw attacks, but Magni was seized within the Shadow's beak. Dark Shadow shook the villain around like a chew toy while attacking Shigaraki and Spinner. Amidst the chaos, the other half of the villain team flanked Tokoyami to get to Bakugo. Twice whipped his razor-sharp measuring tape at the explosive boy's feet. Bakugo moved just in time, avoiding Toga's knife attack. Mr. Compressed twice and Toga kept putting distance between the UA students. Dark Shadow continued his assault on one half of the villain team as he bit down harder on Magni. She cried in pain as her weapon broke in half and her body started to become crushed. Panic washed over Tokoyami.
Don't kill her, Dark Shadow. Drop her now.
Dark Shadow threw Magni away. The villain was slammed into a building before crashing to the ground, completely rendered unconscious. The ground shook with each of Dark Shadow's attacks. Spinner focused on attacking the Shadow while Shigaraki made a beeline for Tokoyami. The Raven team's focus was on controlling his quirk, yet scattered, so he only just avoided being grabbed. Bakugo was only able just to juggle the 3 opponents with his explosions. He was making sure to keep the likes of Toga and Twice at arm's length and double down his attention on Mr. Compress. He didn't want to give that magician a chance to use his compression quirk on him or Tokoyami. The explosive blonde blitzed at the yellow-clad villain. Mr. Compress was prepared for the frontal assault and he fell for the fate attack. Bakugo quickly diverted his trajectory and blasted Mr. Compress in the back. He then thunderclap struck the villain's head before striking again at the back of the neck. Mr. Compress collapsed to the ground in a heap. As Bakugo prepared to attack Toga and Twice, he noticed that his lightheadedness had gotten worse and his hands felt cold.
Looks like I'm not the only one who's struggling with control.
Shigaraki's cackling became unnervingly annoying to the Raven team. Tokoyami was being forced to backfoot. His attention was split between taming Dark Shadow's temperament, defending against Shigaraki, and ignoring the stars that were dancing in his vision. The crusty villain grabbed for the student's head. Tokoyami clasped onto Shigaraki's wrist just as the chorus hands were on either side of his head.
Better keep that monster under wraps now. You wouldn't want to hurt your friend, would you? He might not survive such a lethality in his state.
Shigaraki's sadistic laughter reverberated throughout the area and in Tokoyami's head. He was sick and tired of this man's antics and this whole kidnapping scenario in general.
Shut up. Shut up!
Tokoyami kicked out Shigaraki's knee hard. The young villain hobbled backwards, writhing in pain. The shifting of debris beneath his feet caused Tokoyami to stumble back a few feet. He bumped into Bakugo, the blonde glancing over his shoulders to see his classmates. Both students felt fatigue and pain weighing on them.
I took out the magician guy. What about you? Dark Shadow took out Magni. I don't know how much longer I can keep him in check. Tokoyami, cut him loose!
The Raven team looked at Bakugo with great concern.
Given where we stand, it might be our only chance we've got of taking them out.
Bakugo's rapid breathing and shakiness of his arms and legs were clear to see. Tokoyami's own condition wasn't faring any better. The mental fog was persistent. The spot in his vision wouldn't leave, and the unpleasant feeling of nausea was starting to make itself known. They couldn't keep up fighting like this, but to allow Dark Shadow to run wild? Tokoyami clenched his fists, conflicted. I can't. You could get hurt. Bakugo growled under his breath. A few hundred feet in the air, All For One had been watching the combat, studying the young men. Even in their wounded states, he could see that both heroes in training had much potential and powerful quirks. He wouldn't mind adding Explosion and Dark Shadow to his stockpile of abilities.
California Smash!
All For One caught the number one's hero's fist. The torrent of wind gained the attention of everyone in the vicinity. The UA students were elated and relieved to see All Might arrive on the scene. Maybe now, the odds would be in their favor.
With the number one hero facing off against All For One, the students' resolve was restored. Hey, Bird Brain! Let's switch dance partners. Tokoyami nodded. Bakugo cast a large explosion at Shigaraki and Spinner before rushing at them. Tokoyami turned to Toga and twice. Dark Shadow was practically foaming at the mouth, eager to fight. He's so scary. Let's carve up this bird, Toga.
Okay.
The two villains ran at their target, flanking from both sides. Tokoyami found it difficult to focus on the fight. The stars in his vision were becoming more frequent, and there was a ringing in his ears. And his head, it hurt so much. Why was it hurting like this? He couldn't remember clearly. Dark Shadow roared as it charged into battle, feeling less restricted by his dazed controller. The Shades started with Toga, striking her with dark claws. Toga avoided the first attack and she slashed at the Shade's arm. Annoyed by the little blonde insect, Dark Shadow grabbed her with his other hand before slamming her into the ground. Twice slipped under Dark Shadow's radar and went straight for the source. Tokoyami didn't see the attack coming until the villain was right on top of him. The razor tape slashed deeply into the Raven Teen's leg. The sound of Tokoyami's cry got Dark Shadow's attention. Ah! He dropped Toga and headbutted twice, sending him across the landscape. Tokoyami glared at his opponents as Dark Shadow's eyes turned red. Shigaraki couldn't even get close to the explosive teen. He was playing too defensively. There was no way that Bakugo was going to let Shigaraki anywhere near him. It was easy to keep the leader of the league at a distance, but Spinner was a different story. Bakugo blasted Spinner, but the lizard man was more nimble than he looked. The hero killer's disciple jumped off a wreckage pile. He drew his blade and brought it down at his target. Bakugo blasted away from the attack before launching himself skyward. His muscles pulsed with pain as he blasted higher into the air. From his vantage point, Bakugo could see All Might fighting All For One. The number one hero seemed to be holding his own against a symbol of evil, but Bakugo could read between the lines. Damn it. All Might's holding back. We're holding him back. We have to get away from here so he can kick that guy's ass! A dagger whizzed past Bakugo's head, nicking his ear. He weaved through the air as more throwing blades were aimed at him. Another dagger plunged itself into Bakugo's shoulder as he flew straight at Spinner. He aimed both of his palms at the villain. Die! The explosion rang out and hit its mark. Not too far away from the action, an ice stalk peeked from behind a wall. It took in the details of the battlefield and watched the chaos unfold into a fight for survival. Tokoyami and Bakugo are fighting two villains each. Our classmates look injured, so I'm not sure how long they'll hold out. A panicked expression found its way to Kirishima, Yayurozu, Ida, and Todoroki. Midoriya masked his worry and fear by mumbling to himself, analyzing the scene from all angles. That is it! I'm going in there! Before Kirishima could run into action, Ida grabbed him and held him back. Slow down, Kirishima! You can't just go running in without a plan. Besides, All Might isn't even fighting at full power against that monster. We'd only be getting in the way. Yayurozu peeked over the wall. The scene she saw frightened her. If we're smart about this and work quickly, we could possibly extract Bakugo and Tokoyami without getting involved in the fight. That's still too dangerous. It might be best for us to slip away and let the pros take care of the league. If other pros could be here, they would have by now. Something must be happening somewhere else. We're probably their only hope. I'm with Shoji. I'm not abandoning my best friend again. What do you think, Midoriya? You've been talking to yourself for a while. What? Huh? Oh, yeah. I think I have a plan. One that keeps us out of danger, while also getting Kacchan and Tokoyami to safety. Todoroki, you'd make the biggest ice ramp that you can. Ida and I will use Kirishima like a battering ram to break through the wall. After we get airborne Kirishima, you'll have to call out to Kacchan. Why me? If it were me or anyone else, he'd reject the help. You've built up a camaraderie with him. If there's any of us that Kacchan will accept help from, it's his friend. Kirishima wiped manly tears from his eyes. While all that's going on, Yaoyorozu will use a strobe light that's strong enough to cover the battlefield and blind anyone within that area. Are you able to make something like that, Yaoyorozu? I have just the thing in mind. I can do it. Okay, after we get Kacchan out of danger, Yaoyorozu will turn on the strobe light and blind everyone. That's where you come in, Shoji. You'll extend your arms out, grab Tokoyami, and bring him back here. We'll meet up at the square by that big TV screen. What do you think, Ida? Are we okay to go through with this plan? After a moment of thought, Ida nodded with a determined smile. This could work. We will make this work. Let's do it. You heard the man. Time to execute Operation Saving the Boys. While the team put the pieces of their plan into motion, the fight wore on. All Might was holding out against All for One. Shigaraki and Spinner had trouble getting near Bakugo, even as the explosive blonde was starting to run low on firepower. Tokoyami was having a hard time tangoing with Toga and Twice. The two villains were using hit-and-run tactics. One would attack the crazed Dark Shadow while the other would run in and attack Tokoyami before switching places and repeating the process. Thankfully for the Raven team, not all of the attacks were landing, but he was still running very short of patience. The final straw was lost with Twice's last attack. The split villain kicked Tokoyami in the head. The UA student crashed to the ground, hitting his head on a slab of concrete as he went down. He felt warm blood seep into his feathers. Dark Shadow stood defensively in front of his controller as Tokoyami forced himself to his feet. He glared at the villains, his crimson eyes somewhat unfocused. I'm at my limit with you loathsome scoundrels. Abyss black shadows swirled around Tokoyami. The shade grew in size, his eyes red and cracked. Dark Shadow, unleash your mad banquet of darkness. Show them the torrent of the abyss. Dark Shadow did as he was told. Tokoyami became consumed by his quirk. The feral gloom that had nearly killed Moonfish had returned, seeking revenge. The angry Shadow's movements were different from what they were in the forest. They seemed more directed, more focused at least. Crap! Tokoyami lost control again! I don't think so, Midoriya. This looks intentional. He's right. Dark Shadow isn't attacking Bakugo or getting near All Might's fight. He must still have some control. But he's inside that giant shadow beast. Are we still going to grab him too? We might not be able to. I'll do it. Everyone turned to Shoji, stunned expressions all around. I'll jump in there and get Tokoyami out. That's too dangerous, Shoji. We don't have enough time to make a new plan, which is why we need to do this now. I'm not leaving anyone behind. Tension dwells between the class rep and the Dupla-armed student. I don't know if Yaoyorozu's strobe light will be enough to weaken Dark Shadow in that state. I could give you 60 seconds after the other three are clear with Bakugo to try and talk Tokoyami down from the inside. Thank you, Todoroki. Shoji looked at the visibly worried Ida. Relax, Ida. You've done crazier for less than heroic reasons. I'll be fine. Ida's expression became determined. He nodded before getting into position with Kirishima and Midoriya. Shoji took his position between Todoroki and Yaoyorozu. The three exchanged a look before nodding to each other. Their plan needed to work. The price of failure was too high. With Dark Shadow taking the focus of all the League, Bakugo was free to flank Shigaraki. He wanted to make that creep pay for capturing him. Explosions shocked the area, only matched by the blows All Might was trading with All for One. Shigaraki was thrown from one of the blasts. Bakugo felt pain pulse through his arms. He felt cold and lightheaded. His heart was running a marathon in his chest and his breathing was short and shallow. Come on, buddy. Don't give out on me. I'm not dying here. An impish smile spread across Shigaraki's face. He walked closer to the weakened hero in training. Bakugo tried to move. Fight, run away, anything! Please just do something!
It seems you're at your limit. Did you really think that you were going to escape? Game over, boy.
A massive ice ramp appeared from the sidelines. A wall collapsed and something shot up the ramp. The projectile flew across the sky, high overhead. Come on! Bakugo saw Kirishima reaching out to him, giving the opening he needed. Shigaraki lunged for his target, but it was already too late. A fiery explosion erupted and Bakugo was launched into the air. More blasts rang out as the UA student zoomed closer to his classmates. His hand gripped desperately around Kirishima's, a sense of relief washing over him. While Bakugo's escape had everyone's attention, the strobe lights were switched on. Shoji dashed straight for Dark Shadow while everyone was disoriented. He leapt into the Shade's maw without fear or hesitation. Once inside, he saw Tokoyami. Shadows were wrapped around the Raven teen's body. The last time Shoji saw his friend like this, Tokoyami was frightened and struggling against his quirk. Now Tokoyami was calmed and focused, even as Dark Shadow was raging. The sight made Shoji more unnerved than he'd like to admit. Shaking off the feeling, he carefully approached his classmate. Tokoyami, call off Dark Shadow. I'm here to get you to safety.
Can't. They hurt my peers. Hurt me. Make them pay 100-fold for what they did.
Tokoyami, they hurt my friends!
I'll make sure they never hurt anyone again!
Dark Shadow roared as more destruction occurred outside. Shoji noticed Tokoyami was shivering and his breath was sporadic. You're not thinking straight, Tokoyami, and we don't have time for this. We're leaving. Shoji wrapped all of his arms around Tokoyami just as yellow-orange flames and a bright strobing light struck Dark Shadow. The angry quirk quickly retreated into his controller as flames licked around the UA students. Shoji hit the ground running, holding his delirious classmate closely. By the time Todoroki's flames disappeared, there was no sign of the monstrous dark monster or any of the UA students anywhere. Ida, Midoriya, and Kirishima arrived at the rendezvous point. Kirishima and Midoriya each had one of Bakugo's arms over their shoulders. As much as the explosive blonde tried to keep his feet under him and walk, his legs weren't moving like he wanted them to. They just felt heavy, and it was difficult to just stand. There you two are. Yagyorozu and Todoroki had just ran onto the scene. Where are Shoji and Tokoyami? He had to run in a different direction than planned. He probably took the long way around to avoid being followed. Ida nodded, understanding, but still anxious. The final moments of All Might's fight against All for One played out before everyone on the massive screen displayed overhead. The small, skeletal number one hero continued his fight, even with only one arm at his disposal. United States of Smash! All Might's final punch put All for One down. The symbol of evil was apprehended shortly afterwards, and prepped to be sent off to the high-security prison of Tartarus. The sun began to rise, shining down on the aged and tired pro-hero. The crowds fell silent as All Might pointed at the camera. Now, it's your turn. While everyone cheered, Midoriya did his best to stifle his tears and sobs. Bakugo would have noticed the tears in Midoriya's eyes, but he wasn't entirely conscious. Looks like he won. Hey, you made it. Of course. Tokoyami was carefully cradled in Shoji's arms. The Raven Teen appeared dazed and tired, his eyes half open and half aware. His hand weakly tried to cover his ears to block out the cheering people. Shoji, your arms. There was redness and blistering on the young man's arms and webbing. He could have only gotten that kind of injury when Todoroki's fire was used to take down Dark Shadow. I'm fine, Todoroki. I knew the risks when I jumped in there. Right now, we need to get these two to an ER. Kirishima and Midoriya were caught off guard when Bakugo's legs gave out on him. The explosive blonde had fallen unconscious, and his breathing was quick. Tokoyami wasn't faring much better. He was outwardly in pain from the noise. Shoji covered his friend's ears and shielded him from the light as much as he could. Shoji's right. Midoriya finished, wiping the tears from his eyes. Let's get moving. The group arrived at the hospital and all eyes from the staff landed on him. Tokoyami and Bakugo were rushed to the ER. Shoji was pulled aside to have his burns treated. The rest of the UA students were told to wait in the lobby. The few short hours felt like several days. When the doctor finally came out, the students jumped from their seats. A million questions ran through their minds, but none of them spoke. The doctor, however, could read the most pertinent question from their collective expressions. You kids were smart to bring your friend here when you did. Had they arrived 30 or so minutes later, they would have been worse off. What are their conditions? The doctor flipped through the chart he had in his hands. Bakugo lost close to 700 milliliters of blood and had internal bleeding in his right leg. It looks like a major artery was cut, and the wound that caused it was only sealed on the surface. He had a few other cuts that needed stitches. The muscles in his arms were heavily damaged from quirk overuse, but seemed fine aside from that. Is he going to pull through, Doc? Calm down, young man. The internal bleeding has already been taken care of, and your friend will be all right. He just needs a blood transfusion and some bed rest. And what about Tokoyami? He had a concussion. A pretty severe one, but thankfully there's no permanent brain damage. His throat was damaged, and there were a couple of cuts that needed stitches, but it's something that can't be healed. Tokoyami will have to be on bed rest for longer than Bakugo, and he won't be able to do any intense physical activities for a while afterwards. Is it okay for us to see them now? The doctor looked at the concerned expressions of the youths before him. He pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a conflicted sigh. Thinking for a solid minute. They're currently asleep, but as long as you're quiet and don't disrupt the staff, you can see your friends. Shoji insisted on being in Tokoyami's room while we worked, so he's already in there. The UA students thanked the doctor before moving to their classmates' rooms. Midoriya noticed that Ida was staying behind. Aren't you coming, Ida? No, thank you. I'm going to call Aizawa. As the class rep, I should be the one to tell him about Bakugo's and Tokoyami's condition. Oh, okay. Good luck. The green-haired boy nodded hesitantly before catching up with the others. After finding the rooms, the students split up. Todoroki and Yayorozu went into Tokoyami's room, while Kirishima and Midoriya went into Bakugo's. Midoriya and Kirishima saw Bakugo resting in the bed. Had it not been for the bandages covering his wounds and the IV in his arm to help recover his bodily fluids, the explosive teen would have looked almost peaceful. The League was quite adamant about getting their hands on him. I can't imagine what he had to go through. Try not to stress about it, Midoriya. Bakugo's tough, and we're here to support him when he needs it. Even with the optimism in his voice, Midoriya could tell that Kirishima was perturbed. The redhead's confidence seemed a little too forced. Midoriya smiled to reassure his friend. Right. A soft groan from Bakugo gained Kirishima and Midoriya's attention. The blonde regained consciousness, and his ruby eyes opened. The explosive teen looked at his classmates as they moved to his bedside. Kirishima? Deku? Where the hell am I? You're in the hospital. We brought you and Tokoyami here after we got you away from the League. How are you feeling, man? Like shit. The doc said you have to be on rest for a while. From when he told us, you lost a lot of blood. Bakugo sat up slowly, already tired of lying down. Midoriya became visibly panicked by this. Take it easy, Kachung! Shut up, Deku! A tense silence fell over the trio. Thanks. The explosive blonde could feel his classmates' confused looks on him. He shot a glare at them, but the angry expression came off softer than it was intended to. I said thanks, you morons! If you guys hadn't shown up, me and Tokoyami would have been killed or worse. Shocked expressions came across Midoriya's and Kirishima's faces before turning into pleasant smiles. Wipe those stupid grins off your faces! You're dead if you tell anyone about this! The two boys started to laugh at the blonde's expense. Bakugo would have been fuming if he didn't feel so drained. Excuse me. A couple of the boys in blue entered Bakugo's room. The UA students looked at them, partially confused. We have a few questions we need to ask Bakugo in private. You two are going to need to leave the room. One of the officers began to escort Midoriya and Kirishima from the room. Kirishima stopped walking before he could be removed. I'll visit you later, Bakugo. The blonde only nodded as the police cleared out the room. The door closed, leaving Midoriya and Kirishima in the hallway. In Tokoyami's room, Shoji sat quietly as he watched over his classmate. He only broke eye contact with the unconscious Raven teen when the door opened. Todoroki and Yayorozu entered, their eyes landing on Shoji first. Yayorozu was the first to brave a look at Tokoyami. There were bandages wrapped all around Tokoyami's head, arms, and parts of his torso. Bandages were probably all over his body. An IV was restoring lost fluids through his arm, and a heart monitor was attached to his chest. Although the student was in deep sleep, the expression on the young man's face was contorted in anguish. How is he? The nurses didn't tell me much when they were tending to him. From what I heard, though, his cuts aren't too deep, and the damage to his throat isn't permanent. They seemed concerned about his head injury from what I could gather. The doctor told us that his concussion is pretty bad. He won't be doing much for a while. While the young men talked, Yayorozu walked up to Tokoyami's bedside. Her classmate may have been asleep, but she could tell it wasn't restful. She tried to comfort Tokoyami by holding his hand, but the unconscious student flinched away from the touch. It must have been a nightmare for him. Bakugo, too. I can't even imagine what the League put him through. They're not out of the woods yet. Their mental healing will take longer than their physical healing. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Todoroki didn't respond to that comment. The heart monitor's tempo increased as Tokoyami began to shift in his sleep. His voice, although hoarse, produced fearful sounds. Shoji was by Tokoyami's side in an instant. Tokoyami, wake up! It's just a nightmare! You're safe! The UA students became worried when the thrashing became violent. Yayorozu and Shoji grabbed Tokoyami's arms to prevent him from hurting himself. But that action had the side effect of making the raven-haired teen panic even further. It's your friends! Shoji, Todoroki, and Yayorozu! We're right here! You don't have to be afraid! Tokoyami would have kicked Yayorozu in the head if Todoroki hadn't grabbed the raven teen by the ankles. This stopped Tokoyami from flailing about, but he began to shake violently. We saved you, remember? Shoji got you away from the League. Stop fighting us and wake up! Dark shadow emerged from Tokoyami's chest. The UA students were not expecting the shade to show up and feared the worst possible outcome as they let go of Tokoyami. No one moved and, aside from the machinery's beeping, it was chillingly quiet. Dark Shadow looked around the room, as though making sure it was actually safe. The Shadow's attention then turned to his wielder as the heart monitor's beeps slowed their pace. Without a word from the shade, Tokoyami began to awaken. The UA students calmed down and were elated when they saw their classmates' red eyes open. Tokoyami tried to sit up and look around while Shoji supported him. The Raven teen looked at each of his classmates. Shoji, Yayorozu, and Todoroki. How long was I out? Only a couple of hours. You're going to be staying at the hospital for a while, though, due to your injuries. I see. Tokoyami coughed a few times. Do you need some water? Tokoyami nodded. Yayorozu made a small cup. Todoroki filled it with ice before melting it with a small flame. Tokoyami took the glass and drank his fill. Tokoyami wants to thank you guys for saving him and Bakugo. He also wants to apologize. You don't need to apologize. It makes sense that you'd lose control of your quirk given the situation. No, that's not why I'm apologizing. Then why are you? Tokoyami was silent, so his shadow spoke for him. The villains wanted him or Bakugo to join the League. When their words didn't work, they started to torture Bakugo. The heroes jumped in just as Tokoyami was going to switch sides in exchange for Bakugo's life. Everyone could see that the Raven teen was ashamed of what he almost became. No one was quite sure what to say. But did you actually join them? Of course not. I never wanted to betray any of you. But there wasn't anything else I could do. There's no need for an apology. You didn't betray anybody. You made the best call you could, given the circumstances. He's right. I imagine that even a pro hero would have been forced to make the same sacrifice. A soft smile found its way onto Tokoyami's beak. For the first time in many hours, he felt calm and at peace, despite the echoes of pain his mind and body felt. Tokoyami is happy to have you guys as his friends. That's enough out of you, Dark Shadow. Before the conversation could go on, the door opened up to a couple of officers. Pardon us, we need to ask Tokoyami a few questions. You three will need to leave. Yaoyorozu and Todoroki were willing to cooperate fully, but Shoji was more hesitant to leave his friend's side. I'll be fine, Shoji. I have Dark Shadow to keep me company. Okay, but I'll be back to see you later. Tokoyami and Dark Shadow nodded. Feeling confident in his friend's answer, Shoji followed his classmates out of the room. One of the officers closed the door as the students left. Relief washed over every single one of the UA students. The nightmare that had begun during their summer training camp was finally over.